Hey everyone, today I'm talking with David Serbin, a licensed professional clinical counselor out of California. He's been teaching couples and family therapy at Pepperdine University for a while, and over the last year he's been looking into philosophy and applying Stoicism to his clinical practice. His work has touched the lives of hundreds of people, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say. If you want to support the channel, feel free to click the link in the description below. Hey everyone, it's the Polymath Park Podcast, episode 4. Thanks for tuning in. I'm here with David Serbin, and we're just going to jump right into it. So, how do you feel about Stoicism in your work? Can you give some examples of how you use this in your work, David?
Yeah. So, how I feel about Stoicism in my work?
Well, I guess that's kind of a
Or
two-part question. How do you
okay,
feel about it, and how have you found it to be useful in your work?
okay, yeah. Well, I found Stoicism to be helpful, kind of in my personal life over the past year. Discovered it through the works of Ryan Holiday and the Daily Stoic, and I found that it really resonated with me as someone who has their bachelor's degree in philosophy. I've always loved psychology and philosophy, but I liked that it seemed very action oriented and practical. And as I was learning about it, I find that, and continue to learn about it, I find that um, it kind of seems like it's one of those philosophies that crosses the border of philosophy and psychology. There's a lot of things in there that read to me like therapy interventions, like negative visualization, or keeping in mind that we will all die. One of the concepts is memento mori, remember that you will die. And while it may seem dark, it actually seems to me like that is a reminder that every day that we live should be cherished. And so it seems to me like it's um, one of a few philosophies that crosses that border. And so it really resonated with me. And there were a couple of circumstances that happened over the past year where I found it practical in my own personal life. In terms of applying it to my work, if I have a client that finds value in Stoicism, I may bring it up as a topic. If a client is not familiar about Stoicism, I may bring in a concept or a quote from the Stoics. And usually, when I've done that, I'll wrap up the session by asking how it went, so I get client feedback because I'm very person centered. And on the occasions where I have brought in Stoic philosophy, if people say that the session was good, they'll usually cite a Stoic quote that I brought in or a Stoic concept that I brought in to the session as the reason that they enjoyed the session. And sometimes we'll say that that Stoic quote stuck with them after a couple of sessions afterward. So that's how it's applied to my work.
Right on. Yeah, it's amazing how quotes that seems to be the real like effective measure there. When I've taken my CBT courses and when I was dealing with my own issues that I wanted to work on, it was really the quotes that really stood out to me, and also just like conceptual terms like limiting beliefs and and just like critical thinking ideas. Also mentioning the idea of memento mori, there I actually have a skull that I keep on my desk as memento mori.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
Although this is a
Very
homo,
cool.
yeah, it's a 3D replica of a Homo georgicus skull, though, instead of
Very
a
cool.
human
Does it
skull.
say Memento Mori on it?
No, no, I just that's why I got this is because so Ian McGilchrist, you might be familiar with him. So
Sounds familiar.
he's a psychiatrist and psychologist and also philosopher of mind, and he uses that term very much. And I use the Homo georgicus because it's kind of like a middle between Homo erectus and Homo sapien, and it's not just reminding me of my demise or reminding me that I need to stay dedicated to my work because I will eventually become like this. It's also like a reflection point for me to really look back in time. Like when I look at this, it's kind of like I'm looking back in time at what my species used to be, and this kind of brings me into a state of responsibility in that regard as well. Like I have a duty to use the kind of wisdom and knowledge and intelligence capacities that our species has now, and do something with
Yeah.
that.
That's good. That's good. So for you, it's a kind of a comforting reminder.
Yeah, and it's like the idea people will be afraid of it at first, I think, or it's a little off-putting to have a skull on your desk, but at the same time, there's like an initial fear of that, and then I think once you start doing it, like you really see the value in that. Many philosophers in the past have used that as a tool. So, can Stoicism lead one to becoming overconfident and making mistakes? Personally, I'd rather have this problem in my life than not taking any risks at all, but I just wanted to see how you feel about that.
Um, yeah, probably. I mean, I think there's probably a certain um, interpretation of it that is sort of like being overconfident or being uncaring. But that's kind of for me why uh, Ryan Holiday's work stood out to me, because I feel like he was able to bypass some of the more negative stereotypes and articulate the benefit of Stoicism in a way that doesn't lend to being overconfident or uncaring. I like the virtue of discipline in Stoicism. I think should prevent us from being overconfident. Um, so I think if it depends on how one interprets Stoicism, whether it might lead you to be overconfident. But in general, I think it kind of encourages a discipline or temperance or balance that um, would lend towards not doing it. I think it's a helpful reminder to kind of um, like take a step back. Applying it to therapy, the way I think of it is like, a lot of times, like when we get in arguments with people, um, whether it's as an individual or as a couple, it can be helpful to kind of take a step back, not be overconfident in your position, and kind of reevaluate um, kind of what's going on. And so I think that that virtue of temperance or discipline can help one from being uh, overconfident.
Right. Yeah, so I have a couple more questions on this too. So when I look into psychology methods and into philosophy methods, I'm very much interested in seeing their value and trying to explicate that and trying to really elucidate that in ways that people can understand. And a way of doing that is trying to find potential flaws in what they offer, essentially. And
Sure.
so when I ask these questions, I'm very much in favor of Stoicism, and I apply that a lot in my life as well. But I want to improve it as a field of research, and this is
Yeah.
how I aim these questions. So an example that I heard recently, and they're so rare, but I can see how this can happen. A person was trying to run a 4K marathon or 5K marathon,
Mhm.
and they they didn't really train beforehand, but they had a
Mhm.
lot of, you could say, stoic confidence, or they had a lot
Mhm.
of overconfidence, and they ended up actually passing out in the middle
Oh,
of the race.
shoot.
But they
Um,
were fine after that. But it's like that's
okay.
what you can do with motivation, and that's been largely at the core of what has made my own success, or my own application of CBT, and using the therapy strategies I've used in the past. DBT also gets into this as well. It's like there's a technique called opposite action, where it's
Mhm.
like, I wouldn't normally do this, so let's just do it. And
Yeah.
because life presents these challenges, and this is going to be better for me if I do so. So Marcus Aurelius is a very common example here. He's very often referenced, and I use him a lot in my own work as well. Do
Nice.
you do you think that he could be viewed as an ableist? Now, perhaps in his time, he wouldn't be as much, but do you think that we could be viewing him that way today?
I think he was kind of a product of his time. I don't see a lot of ableism. I may need to go back. It's, as one of those texts that it requires rereading over time. Um,
Right.
but I mean, certainly he talks about kind of a shared humanity. So there'll be parts where it seems like he's more judging, but then he kind of brings it back to like we all are kind of one humanity. But he was a person of his time, and so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And take as much good as we can from that, similar to the way we might look at like the founding fathers. They were very much a product of their time, and so was he, and so were all the Stoics. There wasn't as much inclusion of women. There were slaves. There were there's the way that he reacted. So yeah, I think it's good to kind of take the good parts, and also you're right, maybe it does need a little bit of a 21st century update in some ways. And so so I don't know if he would have been considered an ableist, but he was definitely a product of his time in terms of a lot of his views in society.
Right. It's like there's a lot of quotes from him that can be taken as ableist if you want to, I think. There's one that's like the content, or judge people by the content of their character or by the content of their efforts or something like that. And if you want to, you can take that as ableist. So this kind of like brings me into my next question. Are we in a time period where we perceive ableism and gaslighting too readily? For example, people are using the term medical gaslighting to describe CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy,
Yeah.
which is really funny to me. But yeah.
Yeah, I've not heard that of CBT specifically. In terms of, or maybe are we using the term gaslighting too much? That,
I believe so. Yeah.
yeah, I think there's a balance in society, because I think we've made progress in a lot of ways. And I think it is good to be mindful of how we treat other people. And so that's where I could kind of see like Marcus Aurelius talking about kind of our obligation to others and the theme of justice. The only thing I would say to that is that it's, as we're mindful not to offend others, I think there is value in society not feeling like we have to walk on eggshells. And so I don't think that is valued enough as well. So I think there's a balance. I certainly think gaslighting is a real thing, and that happens too often. Um, but maybe in avoiding gaslighting, some people may feel like they're walking on eggshells, and so that could be a part of the conversation too. Like, how do we make sure that we're um, we live by what we say in terms of treating people with equality and not judging people, and create an atmosphere where people don't feel like they're walking on eggshells. We're good-hearted people, make sure they're not walking on eggshells. So that would be the only thing I would say to that. In terms of the medical system gaslighting, I think we are more mindful that there are alternatives to medication. And so I think, again, kind of going to that balance where it's like looking at those alternatives first, not over pathologizing, but giving people the option who do want medication, if they want that option, or if they do want CBT
Right.
as that option, because it does benefit a lot of people, both CBT and medication, but it may not be for everybody.
Well, I think the way that they're using the term is kind of more like clinical gaslighting. Like when you go into the professional, like, and so I'm really wary of talking about this because it can be viewed as victim blaming and also ableist in the way I'm about to describe this. But it's like people will go into the clinic and they won't expect to find out that all of their problems are their own. And so the therapist is kind of like gaslighting them in that way, or at least it comes off like that. And they're kind of like beset by that. And this is why therapy has to be such a gentle practice.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it does have to be a gentle practice. There are people who are off put by given a label or given a diagnosis. Um, I think of it very much in terms of, I've worked in recovery throughout the majority of my career as a therapist. And there are some people who say, I don't like that term addict. I don't like the term alcoholic. And so respect that. At the same time, there are people who find great value in kind of letting free and letting go and say, yeah, I'm an addict. I I identify with this or that pattern, and I'm part of a group of people that also does that. So I think it's about meeting the client where they're at in terms of that sort of a thing. It's so individualized.
Like a
But
support group, or like they feel like they have a support group behind them.
yeah, exactly. And there's recovery groups that don't use that model too. There's refuge recovery and there's smart recovery, and there's recovery groups that where the people don't necessarily have to identify as addict or alcoholic to get the help they need.
Right. Yeah. The I actually write about this a lot in the book I'm working on, Diagnostic Default. The risks of labels, I believe, are becoming much more prominent and problematic today. The So we have the idea of people saying, I am a depressed person, or I am schizophrenic, or I have OCD, I have ADHD. And there's, like, I talk about this a lot online and social media land, and people will either float to one side or the other. They'll tend to say, this gives me that support, it gives me a sense of inclusion. And we have validation and affirmation and these kind of terms, which can also be quite problematic and also good. And we have the other people who kind of like lean towards my views of this currently from the linguistic ideology, the idea that the way that Wittgenstein described it specifically, he says we are bewitched by language, and we don't really consider the power that these words have, and they can kind of sink into our subconscious or unconscious or whatever, and they can affect us in ways that we don't really realize. And this is kind of existential therapy gets into this too, but I'm very wary of that because it can lead to the invention of new terms like the masking or rejection sensitive dysphoria and other terms that are arising in the public that aren't in any actual literature, but it kind of creates the so there's like a misery loves company complex, and it's like we're celebrating our misery together in a way, which sounds like victim blaming, or it sounds like you guys are just making this worse on yourself. So I have to be very careful about how I talk about that.
Yeah, I think people are kind of we're kind of just, I think we're just kind of figuring this stuff out like as a society. Like I sometimes say like in California at least, I know you're in Tennessee, but I feel like in California at least, maybe not in the country, like mental health is kind of trending. So like it's interesting, like it's now not just clinicians who are using mental health terms, but you find it kind of in general everyday language. Stand-up comedy is therapy, working out is therapy.
Right.
Like this, it's so I agree with you. The language has become very tricky, and I think we're just as a society, I think we're just on like a learning curve in terms of something like rejection sensitivity dysphoria. I think that might be something where like people are learning. So where I hear that, and you could tell me where you've heard that before, but where I hear that is with people with ADHD, and what they're describing is an experience that they have. And so while it is not in the DSM, my understanding of what happens is that people with ADHD, specifically the inattentive kind, or what we would refer to as ADD, they don't have the same levels of dopamine or norepinephrine, which allows it to be like, so like if me and you are having a conversation, I'm listening to you, you're listening to me. But with somebody who has ADHD, the volume of everything else is like is raised, so it's tough to focus. And so since there's inattention, then many of them will experience rejection, and then they become sensitive to like experiencing this over and over again. And so you're right, it's not in the DSM clinically, but I my understanding of why that term's become popular is because people with ADHD have shared through the internet, and or again we're on this giant learning curve. I don't think that would be in the DSM as something, or could or should be, but people are realizing that if you have ADHD and you come off as inattentive in a conversation over and over again, you get rejected, and then you become sensitive to that. And so, yeah, there is kind of a discourse that's uh, going on adjacent to the DSM, where people are now talking about their lived experience with these various diagnoses, whether it's ADHD, autism, or depression, anxiety, or another diagnosis.
Right. Yeah. I guess I should make 2 points here. So there's the point that just because it's not in the DSM-5 doesn't mean that it's not real. That's one way to take that, and also the opposite. You can say that just because it is in the DSM-5, it doesn't mean that it's real, because that's just American style. This is APA certified, the way that we think that brains work, and there's lots of books that get into this. There's one called The Globalization of the American Psyche. The title is Crazy Like Us, and it talks about how we project our type of psychology onto other cultures, and we can actually end up causing damage by doing so. And,
Totally.
like significantly, it's quite.
I agree with that. I agree with that, and that's where I think like cultural competence has come into being more valued. I mean, just to think of an example, like our kind of insistence that marriage is seen in a certain way, or
oh yeah, monogamy versus polygamy is very.
yeah, or that, or like, there's certain cultures you learn through seeing couples where like divorce isn't like, that's just not something that you do. That's not something that you do based on either the place that you come from, or your family upbringing, or your own personal values. And so, yeah, I think again we're on a learning curve, maybe an unending learning curve about the DSM and how it relates to culture, because people are now being more and more open about their mental health on the internet, which I think is by and large a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if it's beneficial, or if it's more problematic, because there's the problem of reification. I also write a lot about this in the book. So
Sorry, the problem of what?
It's called reification,
Okay.
reification. So it's like it's to make real, or to make concretized, and the more that we repeat a word, the more that becomes a real thing. And you can look into the neuroscience behind this as well. A lot of it is theory based, but a lot of it is like the theory is based on evidence essentially, or just observational external evidence. So we have, like, I'm using the term ADHD in this context now when I'm talking to myself when I'm missing a task that I need to be doing at home, and that like attaches to a node of prior behaviors that came before that causally, and then I'll use ADHD to describe a task that I'm messing up at work, and that also reinforces and becomes more real for me in that case. So it's like you're attaching this term, or this symbolic representation, if you want to get into symbolism. That symbol applies in multiple nodes throughout your life, and it becomes reified by doing so. So when we talk about RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, like, this is where I'm very wary. Because it goes quite counter to Stoicism, in my opinion. The idea is that we want to be open to rejection, and if we're doing introspection practices, if we're open to criticism and open and thinking like critically and that kind of thing, we won't experience rejection sensitivity. We shouldn't ever experience that to begin with, because you have the options of, this is useful criticism and I'm going to take that to heart and I'm going to do something about it, or this is useless criticism and I'm going to ignore it and it's not going to affect me. Now, so that sounds easier said than done. A lot of times when this is put in practice, you still feel like rejection, like, oh, that hurt my ego and all that, but you have the cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever therapy practice that comes in to catch that. For me, the CBT, the way that is brought into play is by kind of like catching thoughts after they arise, and deciding if it's unhelpful thinking or useful thinking and that kind of thing. When you have meditation and introspection practices, that kind of works towards not allowing the negative emotions to arise in the first place, or just being in a calm, peaceful state of mind, so that you won't experience that rejection to begin with. So there are many ways where that should never be a term that should be popping up at all. And this is why I'm concerned about this issue, is that because we don't have those practices in the United States, we're getting more of these terms popping up that they're pointing to something that is quite real that people do experience. Yes, we do indeed experience rejection, but is it dysphoric? And so the Greek word dysphoria, it means unbearable. Are we really experiencing an unbearable amount of rejection? It doesn't seem like it should ever get to that point, at least, and certainly it shouldn't be a criteria for a diagnosis.
Yeah, and it's not a diagnosis. I think what people are saying is it's like it's an experience, but it's not. The rejection sensitivity dysphoria is not.
Right. So I try to take that idea of experience as far as possible. So you were using that term earlier as well. When I use the term ADHD for myself, I like to think of that as an experience as well. And so the way I write about this is these are not disorders, they are to be considered disordered states. And so using that terminology has really changed things for me for multiple reasons. So ADHD, it seems like when we do interviews with people or when we take surveys or when you see people talking to a crowd and they ask like, here's the criteria, or they just like list, this is the criteria for ADHD, how many people experience that, and everybody puts their hands up. And then it's like, here's another criteria for ADHD, who experiences that? Everyone does. So it is quite a normal thing for us, and there's lots of genetics behind that. Perhaps it was advantageous for us to be distracted by a shaking bush and all that in the past as hunter-gatherers. So I think of it as attention-diverted hyperactivity disordered states, using the...
Yeah, that might be a better term for it because a lot of people with ADHD have gifts and can hyper focus when they have a task that they're really interested in and want to accomplish, or not just a task, just anything really in life. So you're right. I think disorder may not be the right term. It just may be what the best that we have for right now for people to identify with this shared experience. But as I said, I think we're kind of going on this learning curve as a society where people are being more open about their mental health, and we're kind of figuring out where we're gonna end up. We haven't had a conversation about mental health as a society in, it seems like, the first since 1776 till 2015. So
Right.
it's a long overdue discussion, and we're having it here and not just here but around the world.
Yeah, we're doing it now here, so hopefully this will help.
Right, hopefully.
Well, so
There's two
even...
of us, so yeah.
Yeah, hopefully many people will view this too. I mean, so even saying like having ADHD, like I'm trying to take it as far as to say that people don't have that. It's just an experience that they currently occupy, and it can show up in certain cases. And this allows you to consider it as less of a label, an identity label. So it's hard to like shift into that though, because we can really get into the mindset of considering having certain conditions, even with schizophrenia, and this gets really problematic too, because we do have a lot of genetic evidence suggesting that can be passed down. So we might have like predispositions towards that, but those also can be considered as experiences. And when we look at them through the lens of a disordered state or a disordered experience that we're having, that can encourage the idea of growing past that or growing with that in a way that it can be used to our advantage. And there are cases of people getting over schizophrenia, if you want to use that, like completely healing from it, although they may be few and far between. But we are in this new place of discussing this, and I think that I don't like to to say that it's a new field, because that can come off as insulting to those who are working in the field. I like to make the point that it is so people say psychiatry and psychology, of all the fields of science, are most in their infancy. And I believe that's true, and I also believe they're probably the most valuable fields that we can be putting into action today. So it really needs to be in discussion. Like, this is something that everyone needs to be talking about, and everyone needs to be expressing opinions on, so we can improve it. Because it's so mysterious. I also believe that's why we offer the PsyD versus the medical doctor PhD with it, because it's harder to do direct empirical research on it. It's harder to do direct experimentation post 1960, because that's when we started putting in laws that are circling around human rights, like we don't do the Tuskegee experiments anymore. We don't do...
Yeah, certainly there's some experiments, yeah, that you can't do, like other ones would be like the Stanford prison experiment,
Right.
or that was valuable, but I think even they knew at the time that that was not there was the last kind of experience that or last kind of experiment like that would be allowed.
Right. And the what is it, the Bobo experiment where they had like the Bobo
The
doll
Bobo
with the
doll,
babies, and
Bobo doll, yeah.
it's kind of like child abuse when you consider what they were doing back then. But the
Yeah.
information that we gathered from that was very valuable and easy to put into practice. But of
Hmm.
course, we don't
But
want to do it
social
that way
learning,
anymore. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So we have to derive a lot from observation and social. You can do social experiments, like we still do things like that. Where there's the one where they put smoke under the door, like fake smoke, and
oh
they
yeah,
had like what do they call it? Confederates or whatever, or like the
yeah,
technical term for people that were in on it and they were part
right,
of the experiment. It was like 9 people out of the 10, and they were all just like sitting there ignoring the smoke, like this is normal, and the other person's just like, okay,
yeah,
I guess this is normal, and it's like there's so much to
yeah,
be shown from that. I think that
yeah, on social learning or conformity, yeah,
totally.
yeah.
Well, we could talk about that for a while. Um, I guess I should ask you, what philosophers have you found most valuable to psychotherapy?
Um, I mean, obviously the Stoics would be Michel Foucault to postmodernism and therefore narrative therapy. Um, and I think the psychologists themselves are philosophers in their own right. Like I remember I got my bachelor's degree in philosophy, and we learned about Freud in philosophy. So I think the philosophers in and of themselves, or sorry, the psychologists in and of themselves are philosophers. I had a teacher who said psychology is um, just philosophy and practice. I think that could be said for a lot of different disciplines, but I think there is truth to that. Um, so yeah, those would probably be the most influential. And then Viktor Frankl, I think, kind of borders on philosophy and psychology with existential.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that idea that philosophy or psychology is philosophy in action, that's I fear that is kind of being ignored in a lot of so there's the problem of the monomath. I don't want to get into this too much, but polymath versus monomath perspectives and the approaches that we take with getting a side D, putting 7 years into studying one method of observing the human condition that can hone a very precise lens on the world, that can create a very particularized way of viewing the world, and that can result in only looking towards empiricism and only looking towards the book or the DSM-5. And this is where people start to say the DSM-5 is the Bible of psychology and all that, and and yet it's incredibly valuable. So I've watched interviews where I've seen like very top level psychiatrists and psychologists talk completely from the idea that the person has the condition, or the idea that this is like this is the way that their brain is broken, is the way that I'm starting to understand the way that people are talking about it, versus the wider perspective. And I learned a lot of this when I took my existential psychotherapy courses as well. When you look at the existential givens of life, those are much harder to measure. Those are, in fact, quite impossible. You can't really tell how much someone's death anxiety is getting to them, and it's often hard for them to understand that themselves, or how much someone's isolation is coming into play, or someone's like freedom overwhelmed, like the way Jean-Paul Sartre talked about. We can become experiencing like FOMO and having like too many choices in life and all that. And those can result in what we call anxiety disorders, or what we call even schizophrenia and horrible conditions like these. So we may end up trying to treat the symptoms instead of the underlying cause.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's another one where I mentioned narrative therapy like comes into play. I don't know how much you know about narrative, but there's an intervention called externalizing the problem or naming the problem, and that allows the client to talk about their experiences without feeling attached to a diagnosis. Again, naming the problem is a great one because someone might say, "No, I want to give it the name that it is. Like I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic."
Right.
Okay, that's your choice. So other people say, I want to name it Mary, like marijuana, right? Okay, then we'll do that. And that they find that more empowering. So I think, not over pathologizing and being person centered is kind of the best way to deal with that. But it's a delicate balance.
Of
I won't
course.
deny that. Yeah.
And like this reminds me of what we see in IFS, the idea of addressing multiple personalities and saying like this is the marry me, this is the marijuana addicted Patrick that's talking right now, which I have experienced myself, and it is quite not the person that I want to be on the executive functioner, if you want to use that term,
Yeah.
And this, like, not to get into this, but that is so important to recognize just how different personalities can emerge. Like, we want to say that we have a singular personality that we're operating from, and that we can wear multiple hats. So like I'm encouraged to use a marketing hat online, and I'm encouraged to use a therapy hat in this situation, and I'm encouraged to use a bowling hat if I'm bowling or whatever. But at the root of that, I still have this original Patrick as an operator that's kind of speaking through that from a place of character. But that can become a little too divided, and so we label that when it becomes too separate as multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder is the way we say it now. And that can easily be over pathologized, and that's where I believe that can kind of reinforce the idea that one is schizophrenic or one is experiencing
I think
these other
definitely
disorders.
taking a more cautionary approach to diagnosing is is beneficial when as much as we can, try to lean towards caution and not over pathologizing, because that it can be something that happen where people start to identify it, rather than, as you say, with the IFS doing the parts work and realizing that we're all unique individuals and have unique parts of ourselves. So I think that's where I like that term, like over or not over pathologizing, I guess.
Right.
Like being very mindful and delicate when giving someone a diagnosis, because you're right, it does. People can take that quite seriously, and it can shape their lives for better or worse. So it's good to be mindful of that.
Right. How do you feel about the phrase meditation over medication?
um I mean, I think, again, it kind of comes back to that kind of balance and person centeredness. I definitely think there's benefits to meditation, and I'm glad that it's made its way more towards the U.S. In more recent decades, and in therapy. Um, I think that there are some people where meditation is very difficult for them to do or engage in. Um, and I think there are some people where they are just, quite frankly, paralyzed, and medication is the best option for them. But I think
Right.
that, again, going back to over pathologizing, not jumping the gun towards that, because things like exercise, meditation, in recovery. In the recovery world, we have the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Like making sure you get enough sleep, before you go on that antidepressant. Did you eat? Did you sleep? Um, did you try meditation? And for some people, they do that, and they're able to go about their day, and they say, I don't need an antidepressant. For some people, they're so depressed that they just literally can't get out of bed in the morning, and
Right.
or they're just constantly having uh, suicidal thoughts week in, week out. I've worked with people with chronic suicide ideation, where week in, week out, they are, they're not wanting to, they're not ready to end their life, but they're consumed by thoughts about it. And so that's where, or like things like hearing voices, right? Like auditory or visual hallucinations, which are really scary to live with. Um, so that would be one where medication would, might be called for, or at least trying to see if that can fix it. But I don't think it's an either or. And I do think there is value to meditation, especially like with something like ADHD, and kind of calming down the nerves can be helpful with anxiety, with depression. Um, so, and there is also in recovery, there's a refuge recovery, which emphasizes more Eastern practices. So I do think there's a lot of value to meditation, um, anything that can calm the brain down. So there are a few people that they try it and it doesn't do much for them. And then there's other people that would probably benefit from both. I think everybody could benefit from meditation, and there are cases where a person's experience is so destabilizing in terms of depression, in terms of cravings for a particular substance, um, that that it's chemical, and not much work can be done until that chemical process is managed with some kind of medication. So I don't think it's necessarily an either or thing.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's very nuanced. I mean, the thing that the meditation teachers will tend to say is that if meditation's not working, that means you're not doing enough of it, and that starts to sound ableist. That starts to sound victim blamey, and that starts to sound like it can be problematic because you can't really know for sure that something's going to work well for somebody if they keep doing it more, and it could be that they're over relying on meditation when they actually do need medication. And I think suicidal ideation is a great example of that. When it comes to ADHD, I mean, it's kind of like that's what mindfulness meditation is directly aimed at remedying. Now, if you want to draw parallels between what the Buddhists used to call monkey mind and what we now call ADHD today, you can have that debate. I think there are very strong parallels, but also if somebody is just incredibly frantic, we want to be able to help them as much as possible. But what I'm realizing is that medication it's extremely high potential for addiction and over reliance. So I've had friends that have straight up told me that they're just telling their psychiatrist what they want to hear so that they can get their medicine word for word. That's what they told me. So I mean, I wonder where they were before that. Like, I wonder how they thought before they were introduced to the medicine. And because the brain does this whole compartmentalization and kind of, there's like, I like to use the metaphor of there's a toy called pin impressions for kids where you like push your hand into a lot of little pens, and it keeps the mold of your hand or like your face or whatever, and I'm talking about like the square like frame. And that's kind of what the brain does.
It has like little needles. It has like
yeah, like little soft little pens or whatever. So literally the word pin impressions, like press, I think it's.
Yeah, I think I saw that at like Discovery. Was it the Discovery Museum or something like that?
Yeah, they probably have them there. You can buy them too. But that's kind of what the brain's doing. And so when, like, the brain's neurochemistry as well as its neuron arrangement is very delicate and very influenceable, very easily, very malleable and soft and spongy. And so when we introduce even like what we think is a low dose of a chemical, the brain can be like, oh, this is a new way of operating. I'm going to do everything I can to use this to my advantage. And then it seeks the path of least resistance. I write about this a lot as well. The idea of just compartmentalization and metabolic conservation of energy. Like, the brain is really, really evolved to take the path of least resistance, and this can result in human behavioral laziness as well on the external, but also just the way that we compartmentalize our world and the way that we form perspectives and decisions afterwards internally.
Yeah, I think that's where like I like narrative therapy too, because so much of this, you're right, like so much of language impacts us, and so it's really good to be mindful of that and how we perceive of the medication that we're taking as well as the medication itself.
Right. Well, I could also talk about that for a long time, so let's see.
Yeah, philosophy, psychology conversations tend to be that way.
Yeah, that's a good thing too. So What does self mastery look like to you, and how does discussing this topic play into your clinical practice? It's kind of a big question.
Yeah. So wait, I think I had my first psych professor at my master's program taught me it was like there's there's like consciously doing something bad, or there's unconsciously doing something bad. That's like the least knowledge. Consciously doing something bad, consciously doing something good, and then unconsciously doing something good. And so that's where I think of like self mastery as, I play chess, and I'll play sometimes. I'll play people where I'm like, I don't even think about it. I just make the right move carelessly.
Right.
So I think uh, that's self mastery.
That's a great
I
that's
think
a great example.
things, yeah. So um, in my practice, I'll kind of use the concept of flow states, and I think that helps people with realizing their strengths and their passions, and that can kind of alleviate some feelings of anxiety and depression for people to have something of a flow state or a self mastery, and try to remind people that we have a hierarchy of needs, and just because we may feel bad in one area of our lives doesn't mean that we can't feel really good in another area of our lives. And if you have ever have like hot and cold water, it's tough to you can't really feel hot and cold at the same time. You're going to feel one or the other. And so to remind people of their self mastery, I think can help people in feeling either less anxious or less depressed or both.
Right on. Yeah, that's really interesting, and like having that base state. It's like you're saying, self mastery is essentially securing good base instincts and having that set in. I like a way I like to enter that flow state as well is doing flow arts,
Okay.
the like fire spinning and that kind of thing, or poi. And
Oh,
they're
very cool.
I was really into that in my youth, in my early 20s, and I'm trying to get back into it, and juggling and those kind of activities.
Oh, nice.
And
What is poi?
so poi is like you see Hawaiian fire dancers where they're spinning the fire on a string, or it's actually a
Oh,
chain,
okay.
and it's like a wick, like a ball weaved wick, and you just use lighter fluid and catch it on fire, and you can do it's very it's one of the coolest flow art forms. There's lots of props that you can use. You can juggle fire if you want with the pens, or they have
Nice.
like bow staff or contact staff where you roll like a heavy staff down your body and don't use your hands, and you do everything else with it. That's
Very cool.
uh, it's incredibly like integrative. Like it brings the mind body connection together very well, as well as
Yeah.
Tai Chi Chuan and the flow art martial arts styles. I
Yeah.
believe those are forms of like play therapy, and I think those can be very good for introducing that flow state as well. So, what's your favorite quote on Stoicism, and how do you see that being applied in your life? Do you have a favorite quote?
Yeah, I do. So, my favorite quote is not, well, it's not too long, a little bit, but it's by Marcus Aurelius from Meditations. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for the things I was brought into the world to do? Or is this what I was created for, to huddle under the blankets and stay warm? So you were born to feel nice instead of doing things and experiencing them. Don't you see the plants, the birds, the ants and spiders and bees going about their individual tasks, putting the world in order as best they can, and you're not willing to do your job as a human being? Why aren't you running to do what your nature demands? You don't love yourself enough, or you'd love your nature too and what it demands of you. And so I think of that as like a reminder that it's like, okay, it can be tempting to stay inside and you know watch YouTube or whatever, but as I feel this as a therapist, like I have a job to do. I have to help other people, and so my job is to live is to help people. Um, but in essence, it's also just like to live and like be at my best so that I can help other people. I feel like this is what I'm meant to do, and for other people, it will be different things. Like you brought up martial arts. For other people, it will be a sensei. um, to be a sensei, but whatever it is that you do, and for some people it would be to be a father or a mother, or whatever your role is in society, you were born to do that, just as the bees and the insects do their job, and the job of a human being is to work in whatever capacity that translates to. That is kind of the job of the human, the task of life.
Right. Life is for the living. That's
Exactly.
that's the way he said that is much better than just saying life is for the living, though, because you
Right.
can, like, we're selling convenience, and we're promoting escapism in the United States, I believe, to a very strong degree. And of course, medication also plays into that, but binge watching, entertainment styles, and there's also the language of taking a mental health day. And a lot of times when people go to take a mental health day, it's indeed staying under the covers in life, and or just binge watching, or doing all the things that are bad for mental health, essentially. And instead of like getting out and going on a jog, or doing some exercise, or doing things that'll promote mental health.
Yeah, I think and we all have our vices. Mine, mine might be soda, actually, but I think as long as you're kind of like going towards, like, you have a north star where you're going towards, right? And I think the Stoics, you know, were flawed and didn't always live up to their virtues. But I think if you're moving towards that, that's what none of us are perfect, but are we moving towards that our north star, or are we holding ourselves back from that? That's the question. And so I think it's we'll all take days off, we'll all have vices,
Right.
but are we moving closer to our north star, whatever that is for you? I think that's what's most important, that we move towards that.
Right. And viewing this from the lens of a determinist, I could say that many people have to be taught those virtues and values to aspire to and try to ascribe to. And we're not teaching them. We're not teaching them in school, and we're expecting children to learn it from their parents. And well, they're not learning it from their parents, so really it's up to the therapist in that case, or their friends, to introduce that to them. And that's there's lots of ways to go about that. But once you have that north star established, then you can really start like guiding yourself. And it puts, like, there are ways to view that too psychologically, where it's like it's not really so much work to make those changes to start living by that. It's kind of the opposite. Like, you take your own decision making out of the process, and you just let the north star guide you, and you just keep following that path. And like self visualization as well is also a big process of this. Like where you want to be.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah.
Should Stoicism and existential philosophy come into play after we've tried other modern day methods such as CBT, DBT, EMDR, and IFS, or any of those, or before?
Um, I honestly, I think it could be during. I don't see those things as contradictory, especially, CBT was highly influenced by the Stoics, and DBT was highly influenced by CBT. You see it's in something like radical acceptance. So, right, like that's a concept from DBT that you could probably find, in the Stoics with some interpretation. So, an existential psychotherapy is a commonly used psychotherapy. I use it in my practice as well. So, talking about things like death and meaning, or isolation and anxiety, I think are worthwhile bringing up. I think I'm very person centered, and so, like I said, if a quote or a concept will help a particular client, if it's not relevant, I won't bring it. But if it's relevant to the client and what they're facing, it may be beneficial. And I think, especially with the Stoics, um, when we think about like what brings a lot of people into therapy is loneliness. And so I think with Stoicism, it can be a reminder that, not only are people facing this now, but people have always faced this. And so I think there's something that rings, something that hits home a little bit more. Like, it's one thing to connect to the living, but like to be able to connect to the dead, you're connecting to the universe. And so to bring in a quote or a concept from the Stoics, it's like oh, that's not just the way, it's not just something that's trending that people are facing now. It's something that people have always faced. It's part of the challenge of being a human being in this universe. So, or being on this planet, right? So, so I think I don't think I don't think they're exclusive, especially if a client already identifies as stoic or uses stoic practices in their own life. I don't think it's I don't think it's an either or. I think you could use it alongside CBT. I think it works. I see the similarities with stoicism and existential, and stoicism and CBT, and stoicism and DBT. I honestly, the more I study the other therapies, I kind of find it in a little bit of it in all of them.
A little bit of what? Sorry.
I find a little bit of the Stoic practices in many of the different therapy forms.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. I've been thinking about this for a while. I mean, the the instructors that I'm learning from now are giving me a lot of warnings against using existential psychotherapy in particular, in the ways that you have to be very careful because you can end up exacerbating people's anxiety of death or death anxiety if you're not very careful with the way that you go about it. Or another one is meaninglessness and purposelessness in life, and that's there's a really good philosopher psychologist named John Vervaeke, referenced a lot on this channel, and he has a 50-part series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis that I recommend to everyone. That was very life changing for me to watch that, and it's it gets into a lot of what we're talking about here, but I feel like the where I'm at right now and the way that I'm conceiving of this is that it's probably better in most cases to start with the gentler therapies, I guess you could call CBT or whatever, and then if that's not making progress, then bring in the real roots of the problem, the existential therapies, because that's where that's where you're going to get to some real healing. But like you were saying, it is kind of case dependent. Like if a person already has a good conception of that and of those impacting factors, then it's probably safer to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with you. I certainly, if someone's not talking about death, I wouldn't I wouldn't just bring that concept in, or if someone's not struggling with meaning in their life, I wouldn't bring that in. And so it's very case dependent, and so that's where I kind of pride myself on being person centered and really feeling this stuff out before introducing it, like not bringing it up if it's not relevant. I won't bring in stoicism or existentialism if it's not relevant to the person's problem
Right.
that they come in with.
A lot of that comes with practice too, like learning how to feel things out and how to understand which person you're talking to.
Definitely.
Who are your favorite Stoics?
I would say the big three: Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. But I actually also want to include Ryan Holiday on there because I think he's very articulate the way that he talks about it. And learning about Stoicism, there are people who identify as Stoic who I definitely would not want to associate with. So I appreciate the way that he talks about it and kind of introduced it. So I would say the big three: Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, and then Ryan Holiday, who I think he would identify as Stoic, given that his channel is the Daily Stoic and books are as well. So I say those four. If he doesn't identify as Stoic, I identify him as Stoic. So he's been voluntold.
Right on, right on. Epictetus wrote the Enchiridion. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. And technically, I believe that it was his students who wrote down his teachings.
Kind of
So it
like
was just kind of
Socrates.
funny. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So my understanding is that he did not write it down. One of the books I read recently that I really enjoyed was The Art of Living, which has concepts from both the Enchiridion and why am I blanking on the other one? Um, anyway, it has concepts from his writing, both his most famous works. Not sure why I'm blanking on that.
Heck yeah. I've yet to read that. I really want to though. Uh, was he trapped in a Greek prison, or was that Epictetus? I mean, was that Epicurus? I think it's Epictetus.
Yeah, I think it was Epictetus. So he was a slave for the first 30 years of his life, um, and then kind of gained his freedom. And he learned at a school that would have been considered like progressive for its time, in like, again, in much the same way we think of the founders who were like men of their time. So he learned at a school that taught slaves and women philosophy, and gained his freedom in his 30s, and then went on to teach philosophy himself.
That's amazing. They had schools to teach women and slaves philosophy back then. We don't really think about
Right.
the different types of
Right.
education
Yeah. I
they had.
mean, yeah. You'd think like we're really like we're having such great ideas, like maybe ending slavery would have come in there, but I, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, there were some very questionable practices as well back then that I won't get into, but that's just,
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to me that those education systems were available at all, and like they weren't able to see past that. But well,
Yeah.
so how Stoicism show an interplay with marriage and family therapy strategies? You mentioned you get into marriage and family therapy.
Yeah. So I work with couples. I have done more family work more in the past. Um, but I think in terms of kind of that kind of temperance or discipline, like being able to take a bird's eye view or taking a step back. So like, it's so funny. We've done this whole interview. I didn't really bring up, like, stoicism is, we don't we don't control our environment. We control how we respond to our environment. And so I think, where I see that in couples work, especially I've become very fond of John and Julie Gottman and the Gottman method. Um, they emphasize not responding to your partner with stonewalling, criticism, defensiveness, or am I blanking on so many things today? Stonewalling, criticism, contempt, or defensiveness. Yeah, those four things. So like understanding that conflict will come up, but we control how we respond to conflict within the relationship. And maybe we do have to leave the relationship. Um, I tend to deal with couples where it's a little bit lighter, so I should qualify that when I do see couples, it's usually for stuff like communication. I don't deal with couples who are um, I don't work with couples that have an ongoing DV. Most therapists do not. It's usually considered a red flag for that. So I wouldn't emphasize that right in that kind of a situation. But in a situation where it is really just communication issues, I think learning that, as Esther Perel might say, like we're a figure eight, and so we can only change our partner by first changing ourselves. And so a big way that this comes in is like I statements, like talking about how you feel rather than resorting to blame. And so we can control not engaging in blaming, and again moving towards a north star, because none of us are perfect, but moving towards a north star where we're not engaging in those four behaviors. Again, DV is a totally different situation. So I'm only really speaking to uh, the situations that I see in couples therapy, which would be mostly having to do with communication issues.
Yeah, there's a quote that says, what is it? A relationship is not 50-50, but it's 100-100. Like each person has to be 100 committed to it. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot of times couples will come in because they want to change the other person, but you've got to actually do the work on yourself. And the reason I like working with couples is because usually they are kind of um, um, motivating, or they have skin in the game. They're there because they want to work, and put in the work. So
right. Yeah, that's
individuals do too, but couples can kind of reinforce each other.
right. Yeah, it's good to see that too, because that people are trying to improve themselves, and you can be the like kind of a critical factor in that.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the future of AI and its application to modern day therapy?
Hmm. I I think AI, I mean, it's here, and it's something that we have to have because other countries have it. So it's not as if, right, if we don't have it, it won't be a thing. So it's here. I'm skeptical of its use in therapy. I think one area where it might be helpful is in the note-taking process. There's a number of therapists who are excellent, but they just like don't like taking notes. So one way AI could come in handy is through kind of, if the client agrees to it, and I've heard it's happening a little bit now. Kind of they talk, and that would probably help in terms of person-to-person contact, where you're not worrying, about having to take notes because an AI is transcribing it. So that would be a plus. But I don't think that it'd be surprising to me if it became popular for people to want to see AI like an AI therapist. I think the therapist is one of the jobs that I hope should be safe from AI taking over. I don't know that for a fact, but people have like a really there's a real loneliness crisis going on, and so we're seeing even like text messaging. It can seem kind of vapid at times. It's obviously contextual, but I think people are wanting that person to person contact, whether it's over the phone, through video, or in person. And so I hope that therapists will be safe from AI taking over. Again, I like ChatGPT, and I think something like voice scribing could be helpful. But I certainly hope it doesn't take the therapist's job, because, like I said, we're having a real loneliness crisis, and I think what we need is human to human contact. And sometimes, um, unfortunately, sometimes people only get that from their therapist, and so I would hate to see AI take that over. So there's some function to it, but I hope the therapist function is not um, taken over.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I want to think that this is it's going to be probably in two ways. I want to think that people will gravitate towards trusting their brains with other brains, and trusting, you know what I mean? Like, I want to have another human helping me with my very human problems. And the people that I've worked with in the past have also reported that they feel more comfortable working with me because I share the same symptoms that they've had. So, like central language processing disorder, ADHD, and OCD, I've battled these in severe cases, or these disordered states in severe cases throughout my life, and I've I've seen more receptivity from the people that I worked with because I have a shared history in that regard, whereas these machines won't have that. But the power of convenience also comes into play. So I feel like right now I'm kind of under the impression that people will continue to probably use both. Like, they'll probably see a therapist, and then on the days that they can't see the therapist, they'll turn to their AI therapist. We have these devices. So we have Replica. That's one that's kind of like more relationship based, like what we see in the movie Her, which is already terrifying. And
Yeah.
GPT-O, I don't know if you follow this. GPT-4o just came out about a week ago, and that's kind of based on Scarlett Johansson from the movie Her, and it has instant reply. So it's like you're talking to an instantly reacting device, which is very human. But
Yeah, I think that's where things like BetterHelp or Talkspace can come in. I'm not on either of those platforms, but there are therapists who will talk in a pinch or a moment's notice. So I think having more like a 24/7 talk or text line would I would prefer that. I would prefer human to human contact on the days. You're right. Therapy is usually um, once a week, sometimes twice a week. I've heard of people who do psychoanalysis who meet with clients 3 times a week. But usually, if there's no immediate crisis, a therapist will meet with a client once a week. I think my preference as a society would be that on those days off, if they need that additional support that's kind of therapeutic, that they would reach out to one of those 24/7 talk or text lines. I hope that would be the case over AI. Again, this stuff is coming up so quickly, though, that maybe that is what will happen. But my hope would be that people stay with the human to human contact.
I've heard some bad reviews from BetterHelp actually, and I mean it's a good
Yeah,
service, but I've heard that because there's less attachment and less, it's not really like as contract based, and there's less payment, so it's like $60 a month or something like that. So it makes you wonder like how
yeah.
are the therapists actually getting paid?
And you're right. I couldn't speak to its efficacy per se. I guess I more just mean like that model where
Right,
you
right.
can text your therapist. Some therapists are okay with that. Some therapists will say you can text me or call me on my days off. But for therapists who say, right, and every therapist is going to be different. Um, for therapists who say, hey, I only meet once a week, or hey, I only meet twice a week, I think having a service where they can where a person can have like a 24/7 talk or text and talk to a person or text a person, I think is helpful. I more just meant that my understanding is that those models do have like more, the therapist has more communication outside of the therapy session than some other platforms. That's my understanding of them, is that there's more communication outside, where therapists could kind of send their clients homework or communicate with their clients outside of the therapy session more than some other models. But you're right; those platforms likely need more study.
Yeah, the homework aspect is interesting. I mean, AI could give you homework as well. There's one called Wobot, which is a wonderful play on words, uh, and that's particularly tailored towards therapy. And I mean, the risk I think is that the systems will have better memory than we will, and soon they'll be more intelligent than us just across the board. So the temptation to, I'm already like relying on them very heavily for my own research, but I'm also very wary of how it could be bringing me away from my own ability to think for myself. And I don't think other people are
Yeah,
wary about that. I think most people don't realize the
yeah.
risks.
Yeah, I agree with Robert Greene, who says, like, he kind of worries that with ChatGPT and some of these other AI, that kind of our brains will atrophy, and I think it's something that's kind of good to be mindful of. Like I said, this technology is here; it's here to stay. But I think as much human to human contact as we can have, or as much human intelligence as we can use, the better.
Right. Yeah, Robert Greene's a wonderful mind. I've listened to a lot of his work
Yeah, he
actually.
is.
Very well
Me too.
spoken.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to focus more on the channel in this regard as well. Just in the future, looking at how to responsibly use AI and not let it compromise your human creativity, not let it compromise your decision making capacities. Because I have noticed just having GPS, like I'm 34 now, almost 35, and just growing up with GPS, like I had that through my entire driving career since I was 16, and I can see how it's had the impact. Like my ability to navigate and remember where to go essentially is very much compromised by this available technology, and that's just global positioning system tech. So when it comes to like plagiarization, or when it comes to or plagiarization, and other like things that we've kind of like tried to really tamp down on and make rules against, like now those are going to be compromised because it's hard to know when you're plagiarizing, and also just like exacerbating laziness. I feel like that might be a big risk in lots
Yeah.
of ways, like
Yeah.
creative laziness as well as thinking for yourself, and turning to, so you have like the external locus of control and internal locus of control. I feel like this is really going to encourage external locus of control. And Irvin Yalom talks
Yeah.
about this a lot too in his existential psychotherapy books. The risk of the ultimate savior complex, the ultimate rescuer, where people can go to a therapist and think that it's up to them to fix them. I'm afraid that that's kind of like unrelated to AI, but I think that's also like a big problem.
Yeah. With that, I kind of like the idea of the holding environment. Like the therapist could be kind of a holding environment, but certainly we don't. We'd like for our clients to become less and less like they need to go to therapy, and more like encourage them to um, use resources that they already have, or if they're really struggling to find resources, give them the tools and the resources. Like, so for instance, like with people in recovery, sometimes they are brand new and they literally don't know what's out there. So I think having therapy be a part of the solution without being the entire solution, that probably would help with that problem that Yolam talks about. And I think with the AI piece, I think you're right. There are things like GPS that make our lives more convenient. I think going back to what you were saying about creativity, as long as it doesn't take away what like makes being a human, right? So like traffic isn't what makes a human, right? Sitting in traffic isn't what makes a human, but creativity, writing, being artistic in whatever form that happens, having creative self-expression. Hopefully, AI doesn't rob that element.
Right. I love that term, creative self-expression, as well. Like the root of the word express. It's like to express yourself upon the world. That's that's very valuable. And as much as these tools can lead us to streamlining that process, I think it'll be advantageous.
Yeah.
I mean, I use a digital audio workstation for a lot of the music I produce, and that we used to have a fear of that becoming something that would compromise the creative human muse and how we create music, but it's being viewed differently now. Like, you can use a DAW for anything. You can use it to produce brilliant music scores for a movie and just anything that you want. I used to have like 40 tracks and like 20 effects on each track, just going on ad infinitum. And it's like to be able to truly explore your creativity like that's gives you many more options than just having to work with a musical score, or write onto measures and bars. I'm looking forward to it, man. I think that I think we have a really good future ahead of us if we hone this correctly, and if we know how to guide it correctly. And I believe having conversations like this will help in the future.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, that being said, that's all I have for today, man. So I really appreciate you talking to me, David. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I agree, Patrick. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, man. Is there anything that you'd like to leave with the audience? Any final messages?
I just enjoyed being here, and hopefully your audience finds it a valuable conversation.
Heck yeah, man. Well, here's to the future, my friend. Namaste and all that.
All right. Thank you.
To clarify, namaste can have many religious connotations, but it can also be taken as the light in me respects and views the light in you, and the incredible microcosms in me respects and honors the incredible microcosms that are in you and your 14 trillion cells. 35 trillion cells.
Appreciate that. Well, in that case, namaste to you as well.
Heck yeah, man.